Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled State of the Medtech Industry, Prosperity Ahead of Long-Term Pressures. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Tony Freeman, thank you for joining us. Anthony Freeman has over 30 years' experience in entrepreneurial technology ventures. Mr. Freeman began his career with CUC International before moving on to Chemical Bank. From there, he went on to found and combine companies in information technologies. Since 1998, he has concentrated on the acquisition and sale of materials and precision engineering companies, especially firms serving the medical device component and aerospace industries. Working with a number of publicly traded materials houses, he has specialized in expanding client supply chain positions through acquisitions and divestitures. He has extensive experience in value creation strategies on behalf of middle market industrial clients. Prior to launching AS Freeman Advisors, Mr. Freeman was the managing director of Manning Advisors. Mr. Freeman holds an AB from the University of Chicago and an MBA from Columbia University. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Tony.
Thank you very much, Kate, for the kind introduction. And that's a little bit formal. I'm a specialist in mergers and acquisitions. I focus on specialty chemical industry as well as precision manufacturing industry that people tend to work those materials. And in North America, that pretty much means you do a lot of Medtech. And at any given time, about 2/3 of my practice involves life sciences companies, particularly Medtech companies, looking at either corporate strategy or looking at valuation or looking to do a transaction. About 15 years ago, I started doing an annual report called Global Trends, which looked at trends in medtech, what was going on. And I didn't look for the places that most people in the industry tend to look. Rather, I wasn't interested in sort of the day-to-day or what happened this week, but what were the seismic trends that drive the industry? What are the big issues, which we may not think about in the regular hustle bustle of the day, that are actually determining where the medtech industry is growing? And again, I tended to use a 3 to 7 years horizon. Recently, I've cut it back to 3 to 5 years because I think, as you'll see as we go through the presentation, I think there's going to be a lot of change. And my source materials are perhaps a little bit different than what a lot of people in this presentation tend to read. I'm looking at OEM's presentations to Wall Street analysts and investors at Capital Days or Investor Days or at conferences. I'm looking at what publicly traded contract manufacturers are telling us about what's going on in the industry. And I'm also looking at a lot of government information about healthcare, healthcare reimbursement, financing of healthcare, and demographic data. Okay, let's jump right into it, folks. You're going to get a bunch of numbers. I know it's right after lunch. I'll try and keep them brief, to the point, and realize when I see numbers, I don't see them as boring. I see them as Shakespearean dramas. The medtech market right now, at least in 2024, was about $592 billion globally. And that was up about 3.8% from 2023. It's had about a 5.2% compound annual growth rate over the last 5 years. And you can see it on the chart there with that little burble, so to speak, for COVID. This year, it should be about $625 billion, and indeed seems to be tracking towards that number. This is based on OEM's estimates of how they think 2025 will turn out. And depending on the OEM, you'll get comments where they're looking for growth from 4% on the low end to 8% on the high end. So what's the message with all this, with this information, which is we're seeing continued industry growth. If you picked this industry because you thought there would be regular revenue growth, medtech, you're right, and that chart shows it. It validates the revenue stability of medtech. It's not as cyclical a business as transportation, aerospace, natural resources, and a number of others. Let's go on and go even a little bit deeper into the numbers because there's some interesting stories there. Okay, I have to apologize. This is absolutely the dullest graph I have ever built in my 40-plus long year business career, but it's an important one. Basically, it looks at the cost of goods sold. So revenues are sales, obviously, what company the OEM sold. Cost of goods sold is what it costs them to make that stuff. So it's hung in around 44% since 2021 with very little volatility in a relatively volatile time between COVID and inflation following COVID from stimulus. they seem to have been able to control prices very effectively. So it means not only have they been able to control prices with their suppliers, the big OEMs, they've also been able to pass costs on to customers. The result for them, and again, I'm taking kind of a supply chain view here, is a very stable supply chain. It's being very well managed by the large OEMs. And the message we should take from this is they're accomplishing this primarily through centralized control of pricing expensive. It's no longer randomly all over the place. And basically, they move from the idea of OEMs being purchasers of components and parts from other people and assembling them into a final device to truly being supply chain managers who are kind of thinking in all directions in a much more sophisticated way than they have in the past. That very flat line is proof they're doing a very good job. Okay, this is my favorite slide. And again, we're going to get past all these numbers pretty quickly, but they're important to set what's going on. Right now, R&D spending, and R&D is kind of a misnomer when it comes to medtech. There is some seminal R&D that's done here, but the vast majority of it is product development, designing and building new products to bring to market, is currently about 8.1%. So what that means for those who aren't financial folks so much is for every dollar of revenue that these companies are gaining, they are turning back and spending about a little over 8 cents on that dollar into new products. Now, this was skewed by something over the last few years, which is Johnson & Johnson Medtech, which is the second largest OEM out there, has been spending a lot more than that. And because of their size, they tend to skew the numbers up a little bit. They spend about 10% of their revenues on development. The others, if we took J&J out, it would be around 7.3%, but still very strong investment in new products and rising. The message here, there's a busy product launch schedule coming because generally products launch about 3 to 5 years after the year in which the spending is initiated. So there should be a strong launch schedule of new products coming out into the marketplace. Secondly, we should expect to see higher income for these OEMs because new products have higher profit margins than the legacy products, especially those older than 5 years. The thing that makes Wall Street happy is seeing OEMs rolling out new major flagship products. And this one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. This is something that when I originally wrote this presentation, or a variant of it, I should say, back in April, people were really interested in the question of inventory and where the OEM stood on inventory. Since many people sitting in the audience were basically their suppliers, they were dying to know, are orders going to go up? I'll help you with it. The answer is no. The chart looks at basically days sale of inventory outstanding, how much inventory these guys have on the shelves before they have to go and order something new, before the shelf is empty, I should say. And the point is it's hovering around 175 days. That is historically average for this industry. It was actually lower coming out of COVID as they had to ramp up quickly. And now we're back to kind of where we normally would be. There's not going to be a large scale restocking in 2025. And given the most recent numbers coming in, I don't think, because we're really waiting to hear about the latest quarter, I don't think there's going to be a significant burst of orders going out to the supply chain in 2026. It'll be a good year, but it's not going to be the glory year that a lot of people hoped for. So this leads me to a question, which is, what's keeping medtech CEOs up at 3 a.m? I said, I think the easiest way to get rich is if you could be up at 3 a.m. with a telephone in front of you, and you could let worried CEOs call you at that hour to tell you what's on their mind. Then you'd find out the truth about what's going on. And the answer is, if we try and read the minds of the CEOs of the, say, 30 largest medtech OEMs, what you're going to see is optimism. You're going to see that they're executing on tactical rather than strategic plans at this point, but that they do have some concerns. There's some dark clouds up there, or at least, let's say, threatening fog that they're going to have to start dealing with, and indeed have started dealing with already. And we're going to go into all that. To understand why this is happening, I'm going to take half a step back. Little history lesson. If you were to look at the medtech industry, you would say has gone through 3 eras, or is involved in 3 eras. The first is what I'm going to call the rationalization era. The second is the COVID era, and the third is the realization era. The rationalization era began around 2010. And it was basically a response to change in how companies pay insurance companies pay hospitals, and government agencies pay hospitals for what they do. And it shifted the purchasing arrangements of who makes decisions in hospitals and hospital groups as to what they're going to purchase and why. And what people started to realize at the OEMs, very smart ones, many of them running those companies today, they were more junior executives at that time, but now a lot of them had a very big hand in what happened here, is they started to realize we can't be all things to all people. We can't be in every department of the hospital. We have to pick our battles and we have to dominate in those departments. And so what they started to do is say, let's get out of certain businesses and double down on other businesses. They used a lot of M&A, which you'll see in a moment, starting in about 2014 to sort of reshuffle the pieces of the chessboard. Now, this is largely complete. They generally have chosen their turfs. There still is some change going on. For example, Johnson & Johnson's announcement earlier in the week that they're going to spin off their ortho division. But largely, we aren't seeing the blockbuster moves that we saw back about 10 years ago. Here's a brief list of some of those transactions. I'm sure you're familiar with the names. I'm sure some of you were involved or knowledgeable about some of these transactions. But basically what we're seeing is this big strategic swapping of major OEMs selling off divisions or the entire business and sort of reinforcing other areas. Let's go to the next slide, Heather. It's there for you to look at if you want, but it's not terribly exciting. Okay, so the guys were making progress. They were really doing a good job of staking out their territories, saying, we're going to be a robotic surgery company, or we're going to focus on cardiology and neurovascular and things like that. And then the COVID era hit. Yeah, I know. We all lived through COVID. And what you should realize is it was much more disruptive to the OEMs than most people realize. It wasn't just a question of, hey, everyone's working from home. Hey, it's hard to get things from other parts of the world and things like that. The issue was really what it did is they had to figure whole new ways of working together during COVID. And this particularly affected a lot of the product development groups who were used to working together. Now we're split apart. Now to find ways to work together. And how do they get prototypes manufactured and the like? It slowed things down and took a while to catch up, even after COVID had disappeared from our streets or diminished on our streets. And now we're coming into what I'm going to call the realization era, which has just begun, which is they've concentrated in these core areas, 3 or 4 franchises they can truly dominate. And they've switched from the strategic change to tactical execution. In other words, bringing home the harvest from these exercises. Give you an idea of where these people stand. And again, the people on this list whose quotes I'm giving you were people who were architects of a lot of the change that I was discussing. Mike Mahoney basically saying, we continue to aim to be the highest performing differentiated large cap medtech company. That's our aim in 2030. That's not pulling any punches on Mike's part. He's coming out and saying, we're looking ahead to good years. Kevin Lobo, very similar to sort of terminology. Our strategy is working, and I believe Stryker's best days are ahead of us. And Jeff Martha of Medtronic, we are executing well, and I'm confident in our future growth trajectory. So right now, they're sort of taking a victory lap. They're confident in strong, consistent growth. And as I said, that focuses on execution, not redefinition of who they are. They're tactically executing. If you read what these guys are talking about in their conferences, they're talking about expanded sales and marketing teams in different parts of the world. They're talking about key product launches. They aren't talking about what businesses they should be, and those decisions have largely been made, at least for the foreseeable future. There's no talk really of remaking business. It's more about what's improving what's in place. They've committed to the markets, and they're starting, as I say, to harvest the markets. But I want you to realize, again, it's 3 a.m. and the CEOs are sitting up worrying about the future. They're happy where they are today. But one thing I've seen about medtech OEMs in particular, not so much the supply chain companies, but the OEMs, is they really do look carefully at the future. And sometimes they may make strategic mistakes, but by and large, they're pretty good strategic planners. They see a new era of healthcare economics that's going to change the nature of what products are made and who makes them. And we're going to talk through those 3 points right now. Let's go to the first one if we can, Heather, larger patient loads. Okay. If there is a number that you want to walk away from this presentation with knowing, the number is 2. There will be twice as many people over the age of 60 by 2050 when we hit peak human population. Believe it or not, the human population goes down after that. But we're going to have twice as many old folks as we do before. The middle of the baby boom curve is coming in right now to peak medical spending years, and they're going to be there for a while. Developing nations, well, they aren't quite as aged, I will say, as perhaps most of the developed nations, but they aren't far behind. And the rise in populations receiving medical care in developing countries is often also going up. So a lot of places are really getting modern medical care in developing countries for the first time, a clinic or a hospital or something of that sort. There's a fair amount of patient load increasing. I deeply apologize for this graph because I think it is also one of the ugliest graphs I've ever built, but it's really important. The numbers come from the United Nations, and they're very good, I find, at calculating population growth. In 2020, there were 1 billion people over 60 on Earth, and that was 12.8% of population. The other thing, it's the first year in history that there were more people over 60 years old, in other words, heading into retirement, than under 5, meaning the people in a few years would be getting jobs and paying for all those old sick people. So that's when it started to tip. And by 2050, as I pointed out, we're up to 22% of the global population is over 60 years old. Okay, so we've got an avalanche of old sick people coming at us. And what's going to happen? Who's going to take care of them? Well, there's a healthcare worker shortage globally already, and it's about to get a lot worse. Training and hiring have not kept up with demand. Basically, the World Health Organization is seeing a shortfall of about 11 million healthcare workers, primarily nurses and midwives globally, by 2030. Excuse me. By 2037, the United States, the largest medical market, a wealthy, well-funded market, is expecting a shortage of 187,000 doctors. Okay. And you say, was that big or small? Well, right now there's just over 1 million doctors in the United States. So yeah, it's a very significant number. And I happen to mention Costa Rica because I originally gave the variant of the speech in Costa Rica. And even a country like that is actively looking to other countries to try and bring in medical professionals because they can't keep up with the population demands there. Realize that most of the caregiving facilities, call them hospitals, call them clinics, call them doctors' offices, are really still using procedures and models that were developed for treatment decades ago. If your grandfather walked in, well, my grandfather at least, walked in to a doctor's office today, other than a TV screen on the wall, I doubt he would have a much different experience than he did then in terms of checking in, records, the like. This isn't going to support that type of growth. I've said to people on the supply chain side who run state-of-the-art modern manufacturing palaces and have completely rethought every process in their factory every 5 years or so, and in no way make a part the same way they did in, say, 1980. When they look at how the healthcare community goes about its administrative work, dealing with patients and the like, they go, this is the 1950s. So there's a requirement. We're going to have to improve workflow, and provider support is going to have to start being built into some of these devices because we don't have enough folks to take care of the old folks now, and certainly as more of them come in. This is one that's become, we're going to talk more about in a minute, but this is one thing I think everyone should be aware of. We're at maximum reimbursement. Right now, the U.S. spends about, it depends, 17.5%, 18.1%, pick your number, it's somewhere in there for healthcare. Other developed nations spend anywhere between 11 and 17% on healthcare. And for non-economists out there say, well, is that good or bad? An economist would tell you that's way too high, that while it's humane and valuable and improves life and does all sorts of good things, healthcare doesn't really help build capital and grow economies. It's not like steel making or shipbuilding or chip making or more farms or whatever. It's basically a use of capital. And the point is that when you're spending that much on it, you're sort of starving the future a bit. Plus, you really can't come up with a lot more money to put in than we already are. Nations, in fact, are borrowing to cover healthcare today. In 2024, the United States borrowed $850 billion just to pay for Medicare, Medicaid, and the Veterans Administration. In portion, they were total about 2.1, $2.3 billion dollars taken together. And I mentioned Costa Rica, $920 million. Let's go on, Heather. I should have taken the Costa Rica references out. So what are the implications of these 3 points? We don't have enough money because we have more old people than young people. We're already at peak or near peak healthcare spending in developed countries. We don't have enough providers. We don't have enough staff. And COVID also demonstrated the limits of healthcare capacity. We went from 81% capacity in US hospitals to about 118% at the height of COVID. And you can see it almost destroyed our healthcare system, burning out doctors, nurses. It's not built for that sort of surge capacity or that kind of growth or those kind of numbers. So what's going to be done about this? What can the device companies do, the medtech companies? What are they doing to start addressing some of these issues that are coming on and fundamentally going to change healthcare? One thing that they're doing is they're digitizing, and they're digitizing in a very specific way. If we were to get into a time machine and go back, say, 10 years, 5 years, and we were to walk around, say, I don't know, an operating room, and we were to look at the instruments that are laid out for use, you would see some of the most technologically sophisticated devices in the history of the world. You would see minimally invasive surgical devices. You would see all sorts of regulators, controls, and the like that are used to deliver anesthesia. You would see products that are, the engineering tolerances are incomprehensibly small to do what they have to do. They're masterpieces of electromechanical design. But you would have seen something that's a little bit weird. For all this extraordinary technological expertise, you'd say, I don't see a lot of electronics hooked up to this stuff, because it wasn't. Only recently have we really started tying together all the devices that a manufacturer makes via digitization and taking advantage of the ability to share that information in a meaningful way to get patients better, faster, and out of hospitals. Right now, and this is an easy thing any of you can do, pick up an annual report from any OEM, publicly traded OEM, and 28 of the top 30 are publicly traded. You'll be able to sit there and you're going to find the same thing in each one of them. You're going to find a beautiful, colorful spread in the middle. And in it is going to be a list of all the products they're bringing out with little pictures of them and sort of the timeline of when they're going to come out. By my last count, and this was a few months ago, over 60% of announced medtech products by the top 30 OEMs are either digital or have digital content. Why are they doing it? Again, they're therapeutic benefits. They're putting it in not because it's fun and people like little lights on things. It's because they share information well. They alert doctors earlier as to problems. They spot things, and as a result, they lower costs of care. Nothing, it's always cheaper to treat a disease earlier rather than later. Secondly, there are workflow benefits. The devices can notify members of staff or other pieces of equipment about what they're supposed to do. But the other thing that gets really interesting, and this goes back to that staking out the territories point, is it becomes a barrier of entry for competing OEMs. I'm going to talk about something else rather than this slide. I'll talk about this slide in a minute. But I'm going to give you an example that may make it clear. Don't look at this slide about Becton Dickinson. Think in your head about Intuitive Surgical. Intuitive Surgical has the Da Vinci robot. We're on version 5 right now. It completely dominates the soft tissue robotic surgery market. But think about it from a business perspective. You're in an operating room and there's a Da Vinci right there. Pretty much at that point, Intuitive has locked up that operating room and other operating rooms, because usually they don't just sell one to a hospital, they sell several. And they're keeping their competitors out. Unlike, for example, surgical instruments 10 years ago, where you might find in the operating room supply area 5 or 6 different competitors, choice, and the doctor would choose the one they wanted to use. Here we're seeing standardization. And when you start putting together these product suites, there's no room for outsiders to come in. The company that gets in there first with that digital suite, sharing information amongst multiple devices and staff members, they rule the roost. There are not going to be three robots in one operating room. There's going to be one. Let's look at this slide now, product suites, not product lines, Becton Dickinson. I mentioned this one because here you can see one of these suites evolving. In 2024, Becton Dickinson acquired Edwards Life Sciences, critical care unit. So this is they made equipment that basically, if you're the ICU or the CCU, is the thing that keeps track of all the beeping and lights and reports back to the nurse's station and, basically also managing your hemodynamics and the like. They bought it and have been combining it with their own Becton Dickinson products with the idea that they will be able to combine hemodynamic monitoring. In other words, what shape is your blood in, how much oxygen is there, other gases, how fast is your heart pumping, things like that, what's your blood pressure, with medication monitoring so they can adjust medication very quickly depending on changes in a patient's condition. These are used in operating rooms, and as I said, they're used in more intensive care settings. It brings two systems down to one. And the point is that once you put in, when they do come to market with the full offering, a Becton Dickinson advanced patient monitoring system, guess who else's is going to be there? Nobody's, because there's no room for anybody's. All Becton Dickinson technology at that point, at least relevant to this area of medicine, will tie into these products, whereas competitors' products, right now, there's no clear path for how they could do those sorts of things. So this gives an opportunity to medtech companies to further cement market share in their chosen their chosen markets. Another thing I mentioned is workflow automation. Now, all of us have been to doctor's office and seen people writing things down on pieces of paper that go into folders, and increasingly they're doing it on computers, absolutely. But the point is that very often when you go, for example, to check out and pay your bill and things like that, that's a whole thing. And then the mail, something comes in the mail later and all that. Again, we're looking at a very kind of broken system for administering all of healthcare, not just the therapeutic portion, but all the workflow and everything that has to go along to record records, to get people paid, to track what people are doing, and the like. ResMed is a company, I don't know if many of you know, they make sleep apnea devices. You see those on TV. That looks like a fighter pilot thing that you wear if you snore too much. They've gone a lot further. It's hard to see on that slide, but you're going to see a bunch of logos. What they've done is they've bought a bunch of companies. And they put everything together. And basically what they are providing a complete soup to nuts system for managing this sort of pulmonary sort of treatment. It starts right with the sleep apnea machines. If they are hospitalized, it will continue to track that information. If they go to a rehabilitation center, it will pass all the information to the rehab center and then back to the physicians and the like. In addition, it automatically orders supplies because it keeps track of what's used, and it handles all invoicing to the insurance company and to the patient. This cuts out a lot of people, a lot of time, and a lot of spending. And as a result, ResMed has been able to really kind of dominate in that sleep apnea, pulmonary care sort of space. Right now, SaaS revenues, so the software side of what they're doing, it's about 13% of their revenues, and they're a $3 billion company, basically. So this is coming. Not only is the device being digitized for better therapeutic results, it's being digitized so it's easier to do healthcare business. This digitization is the biggest trend I think you're going to see. The devices increasingly are going to be digital. And we'll get to in a minute why that changes who builds these devices and how they're thought of and how they're positioned. But when I worked on the first variant of this presentation, the people asking me to do it asked me to speak on two topics that I really didn't want to talk about. Tariffs and healthcare. I said, I don't want to discuss politics. They said, we'd really like it if you would. I said, I don't know if they'll let me back. This was in Costa Rica when the presentation was done. I said, I don't know if they'll let me back in the United States after they see what I have to say, but hey, we'll give it a try. And besides, I could stand to work on my Spanish. So let's go ahead and take a look at tariffs. For those who don't speak Spanish, this is the only part of Spanish in the entire presentation. That says una guerra sin ganadores. It means a war without winners. I can't come up with a single way that the current US administration's tariff policy, ever changing though it might be, in any way benefits much of anyone. Not only is Medtech an export business for the United States, this is going to create barriers to that. We're going to see more content created overseas and consumed overseas as a result of tariffs. It's disrupting supply chains because no one knows what anything costs anymore. It will, in the end, I think, increase interest rates simply because you're an economist, it introduces certain types of inefficiencies where the protected industry can be a little bit sloppier about how they do things because they have a price moat protecting them. It will increase labor costs. And that's going to be the first thing that most companies are going to see is it's not going to be, oh, I have to pay a lot more for stainless steel tubing or for resin for injection molding or to have something assembled that way. It's going to be someone coming into their office Friday at 5 saying, boss, I need a raise. I just can't pay for the groceries now. Everything's going up in price because of the tariffs. This is where you're going to see the bite. And again, I can't come up with any good answers to how this could be better. Again, I tend to be a free trader, but I challenge anyone and would love to hear from anyone who thinks there will be benefits to tariffs. The other thing is for some of the low-cost countries, there may be some opportunities for them to gain additional share from what is now the American market, but I can't predict it because things are just changing too fast. Quickie, my son imports caviar from Ukraine, of all places. You should try importing a perishable product from a war zone. He has some fascinating stories. But the issue is that his biggest competitors are Chinese producers, and he doesn't know from day to day whether they've got a 15% tariff or 145% tariff, so he doesn't know how to price or how much product to order. Again, this applies to healthcare in much more sophisticated and complex ways. Healthcare spending cuts. Guys, this is something where I'm like Chicken Little running around that the sky is falling, and maybe you guys can grab me by the collar and pull me back. We've seen this happen. This slide was written before we had the Big Beautiful Bill, which starting in 2027 will start to pull back some of Medicaid spending. We're already seeing that right now with the government shutdown. There's some very significant question about whether some of the Obamacare subsidies that really, tens of millions of Americans rely on to be able to get health insurance at all are going to be canceled. And so you have to realize that any cut, by the way, in the US has an outsized effect globally. Why? Because we're 4% of the population and we're something like 37% of global healthcare spending. The reason that this is the number one market is bluntly, we overspend for product. If you look at a product in the United States, a Medtech product, it would probably cost less in England or France or Germany or Japan or Turkey or someplace where a national health service is bargaining for them. We're starting that. We have a long way to go. Hence, every product is designed to succeed in the US market because it's the most profitable market out there. Once you start cutting back US healthcare spending, you're going to make that market less attractive. As a result, what you're going to see is a slowdown in product development because, very frankly, that rich source of income to recoup all the development costs and then some is going to be smaller than it was before. And again, I wish I could give you specifics here. I don't know how this is playing out other than to say it's going to be a very rocky road if we don't change something quickly. A couple of other things. The short-term effects of the healthcare cuts is going to lead to closure of hospitals, and particularly the rural hospitals and inner city hospitals. So there's some talk of some relief for them. No details out there at the moment. This means fewer devices will be used, and there will be a decline in the world center of money for devices relatively quickly. And as I say, the long-term effect isn't so much the loss of sales. It's going to be slower or less innovation. Let's move on then to the supply chain. So, okay, so the first 2/3 of this presentation have really focused on what's going on with the OEMs, the medtech people, the people with their logo on the side of the device that's being used. Let's talk about the people who actually make a lot of those devices, though. Let's go ahead, Heather. Okay, how big is the supply chain? If you look at the global medtech supply chain, and this is again not the OEMs themselves, but companies that make stuff for the OEMs and sell it to them, they get made into a product or packaged into a product. It's about $90 billion in 2023. It's a really murky number, guys. There's no commonly agreed to way of judging it. So it's a lot of triangulation, but a bunch of us seem to end up in roughly the same place, somewhere between 80 and 105 billion. My calculation was 89.9, hence 90. Fine. That's where we are. That's about a third of medtech is outsourced. So the way we do it is we look at cost of goods sold for the entire industry, which isn't all that hard to calculate. And then you look at that $90 billion saying, well, about a third of it's already outsourced. That's the sweet section of the growth curve. That's the easy stuff to get. I estimate about 7 to 9% year on year growth in the supply chain. This is much through 2030. This is lower than just about anybody else's estimates. I find a lot of people making the estimates. I don't know how much espresso they drink or where they get it from, but boy, I can't justify those kind of growth numbers. I do see the growth starting to decline about 4 to 6 years from now. The growth rate, not the growth, but the growth rate, as really we sort of hit this sort of maximum outsourcing. I don't think we're going to move much beyond 50, 55% of the industry being outsourced for IP control reasons, quality control reasons, commercial competitive control reasons, things like that. But there's a ways to go to grow, and it will grow faster than its underlying market. What is the relationship between OEMs and their supply chain? I have to be blunt. You can go to any supply chain person, particularly late in the afternoons, and you're going to hear nothing but complaints about their customers. They're slow, they're disorganized, they pay late, they don't know what they're doing. The answer is that's not true. They have crafted the supply chain they want. The majors in particular, those top 30 to top 50 OEMs, have crafted the supply chain they want. It's the rise of the multi-billion-dollar supplier, like the Jables and the Flexes. Jabil's the largest out there, and they're between around 2.7, 2.8 billion for healthcare, I believe. They don't quite break it out that way, but that's close. I mean, we're talking about a multi-billion, and there are 3 or 4 or 5, I think 8 others who can claim to be billion-dollar suppliers. Those didn't exist 10 years ago, not even close. This has all been done through consolidation. And there's another huge group of about, I'd say 20 companies, maybe a little bit less, in the 500 million to $1 billion of annual revenues. Why do OEMs want to work with big suppliers? Why don't they want to work as they did in the past with a number of very skilled smaller houses? And the answer is, and this is a presentation and discussion in and of itself, there's a risk transfer going on in this industry where OEMs are transferring their economic, I'm not talking about risk like danger, like driving down an icy road or something like that. I'm talking about economic risk where there can be an upside and there can be a downside. Here, they're transferring risk, their manufacturing risk to their suppliers. One, they don't have to build the new factories. The supply chain does. That CapEx is on the supply chain, not on the majors. They don't have to manage subcontractors anymore because they pass management of the subcontractors on to prime contractors in the supply chain, something that we're starting to look more and more like an aerospace type supply chain. Not quite that structured, but moving in that direction. They make them finance the working capital. They have to sit there. They keep stretching out terms. And they make them finance inventory. The suppliers finance inventory. The quality systems are, you guys know, incredibly sophisticated and complex and expensive. And in result for all this, shoving this risk off their desk and onto someone else's, they save 5 to 10% because they generally have higher overhead of manufacturing. So it really is working for these guys. And why do they want big guys? There's one big neck to choke. You aren't worrying about Jabil going out of business. You may be worrying about your $20 million machine shop down the street or whatever, no matter what a wonderful job they may do in building some critical component for your device. You'd rather just give it to Jabil and know the thing's going to get made right, and they'll worry about those things. This model works for the OEMs. They want to deal with the big guys. Some of the big guys, in fact, won't take anything under, say, $5 million or something, or demand a certain percentage of all the content that OEMs put out to basically exchange for a good price. This is something that's new and evolving. We don't have a lot of details on, but we're seeing basically they're starting to call the tune. Let's go to the next slide because it talks more about that. The OEMs are also using their outsourced partners for pricing leverage. In exchange for more volume, they get a better price. Yeah, it's fair, it's business, makes sense. Doesn't not unique to this industry or any industry. Common sense. You give me more business, I'll give you a better price. Medtronic, the largest out there of the OEMs at about 33, 34 billion, is basically speaking openly in their conversations with analysts about they see their scale and their ability to do these sort of major outsource deals as a competitive advantage to enhance profits. In other words, if we can do more deals with the big guys who will give us better terms and prices, we can promise you, Mr. and Ms. Analyst, better results. So they're really keying into some of this as their ability to stake forward, control their supply chain, yet benefit from pushing off more onto them. The other thing is something very radical has happened, which is we are starting to find out that they are willing, the OEMs are willing to outsource IP. In plain English, they're going to let other people design the products, get it through the FDA, get the 510K. The supplier will hold on to the file and the like. They may even own the IP rather than giving it back to the OEM at the end. This is a massive step. OEMs traditionally had not been willing to let design out of their hands, but they're finding, especially when it comes to line filler type products, I'm not talking the big flagship products. I'm talking about, little line fillers that give them a slightly better competitive position. They're willing to outsource that stuff. And they're willing to let these contract manufacturers do seminal design as well as take the risk and manufacturing of the new products. This is great. They don't really have to commit to that much. They have to commit to something, but they don't have to commit to as much. And they've just expanded their ability to bring new product to market with, again, risk transfer to the people who are developing it, who are in the hope of getting a large manufacturing contract. But pendulums swing, and I think this is going to continue to swing in the direction we've just described, but I do want to point out some other things. By the way, I was asked before this presentation, and I'm almost there, if we had any, if all our art was royalty free, and the answer is yes, it is. And that's why we only have this ugly crow picture or raven or whatever it is, as opposed to something more horrible. The question becomes is, OEMs are starting to ask themselves, are we overly dependent on two huge large suppliers? They're not worried about them going out of business. But they're worried about when you give that much business to one or two suppliers, they start to control delivery to a much greater extent. They start to cede some control when they pass things off to the majors. They can hammer the little guys. They can't so much the big guys. They've got 20% of their content or something like that. Further, many of those big CMs work with multiple OEMs, including their competitors, and can trade off depending on what the opportunity is for them. And often the switching cost is just too high to say, no, we're going back to working with three smaller guys or something like that. So they're trying to figure out what's the borderline for this. Is this really an issue? This is an evolving area. And the other one is, are the OEMs creating their own competitors? Okay, one thing you notice about an OEM is their gross margin is generally about 64% if you look across the industry. So for every dollar of revenue, they basically have to do about 36 cents of manufacturing to make the product and get it out there. So their gross margin on top of that is 64%. Yeah, they've got a lot of other things to pay for, obviously, overhead, research and development, the interest, the likes. Well, realize the supply chain companies look at that and realize and look at their own gross margins, which might be in the 20s or 30% range, and say, we're doing all the work. We know how to make one of these things. We actually know a lot about the medicine involved because we did the design and design for manufacturing, and then the actual manufacturing itself, and we've been making it for years. Why don't we just make the thing and slap our own logo on the outside of it? Has this ever happened? The answer is yes, it has happened. Teleflex Medical. In the 1970s and early 80s, Teleflex was a company that happened to make telecommunications equipment like ribbon cables and uh, things that basically went into telephone systems. They happened to stumble into some medical stuff and said, "Oh, we like the margin of this," and they started getting more and more involved. Well, fast forward, they were doing basically injection molding and some assembly and some other odds and ends for major OEMs. And now Teleflex is exclusively a medical device company that sells, yes, they'll still do contract manufacturing, but the bulk of their revenues is direct competition against the OEMs that started them out. They have their own branded products, particularly in cardiovascular products, so they have a number of others as well. And this is something the OEMs worry about, which is, are we teaching these people how to go into business against us? This again is a very sort of sensitive area that's still being felt out, especially with the outsourcing of design and IP, as to where the lines may be. And the last question I had, which is one I don't think is going to be of interest to this audience, but one I've spent the year thinking about and still don't have an answer to, is there overcapacity in the supply chain? As a result of all this outsourcing, have the guys in the supply chain overbuilt their facilities and said, well, I'm going to have 40 machining centers, but they can only keep 28 of them busy because they were hoping that they would continue to grow at the same rate with the same situation they were facing 5 to 10 years ago. I don't know what's happening there. I still don't have a great answer. My sense is yes, we have too much capacity in the supply chain right now, and it will have to be absorbed perhaps a bit painfully over the next few years. That's it. Folks, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate.
Thanks very much, Tony. We do have a couple of questions to get us started. First, are you able to talk a bit about the impact on the medtech industry of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020?
Yeah, it's going to be a freaking. Basically, what it was had started to even out prior to the current administration. What we were seeing is indeed very effective ways of structuring where products were manufactured, particularly Mexico and the US, lesser extent to Canada. Mexico and the US, this is all in chaos right now. And you have a number of contract manufacturers, no, some OEMs also, who are sitting here scratching their heads saying, why did we just invest $800 million building this magnificent plant outside of Tijuana when it may cost us a fortune to get it back into the United States? This is all being fought out right now. And I think everyone is basically throwing their hands in the air as a result of the tariffs. But the tariffs are extremely disruptive to the planning that went into North American trade agreements.
Thank you. We see
And
we
trust
do.
me, no one has an answer. Right? If you find someone who does, I want to meet them because I have yet to meet a person who has any answer to what's going on, especially given how rapidly it changes.
Well, on that note, we do have a question also asking you to predict the future a bit. They're wondering what the industry is going to look like in 2 years after we've had a couple of years of tariffs impacting this space.
I think what we're going to see is diminished US manufacturing in medtech, not by much, but by a little. And the reason is again, I think it has more to do with the cuts that are going into place. That very frankly, it'll just be a less attractive place necessarily to make products with the retaliatory tariffs and the like. I think we're going to push more med tech out to other parts of the world. It won't be a huge change in 2 years, but I do think it will be noticeable.
Okay. We also have a question about reimbursement and how trends in reimbursement might be shaping the industry. Do you have any
Now
thoughts in
that's
that area?
that is a truly fun one. And if you want to put people to sleep at a cocktail party, I strongly recommend you start talking about healthcare reimbursement. Yeah, basically, VBR changed everything. So, value based reimbursement instead of fee for service radically changed what was going on. And it's something that, in the end, I think is very good for the global healthcare system. But what's happened is where you would think that the OEMs in particular would be against it, they love it if they have a world beater product and they can show statistically or through clinical studies or whatever the improvement because of VBR and the way hospital buying groups think, which is how do I get the total cost of care down? And this product works better and get someone out of the hospital half a day sooner with 5% fewer readmittances for infections. Yeah, they're going to go with that. So this is something, again, that has to go back to those choosing their turfs. They're trying to show that their products are superior to take advantage, particularly of the reimbursement situation. There's something else going on too that has to do with consolidation of hospitals globally, but we don't have to get into that right now. The bigger part is value-based reimbursement.
Have you
It's
noticed
fundamentally
any?
changed how products are sold and which
Have
ones
you?
get bought.
Mhm. Okay. Have you noticed with federal staff reductions whether there has been impact on the industry? They're asking about FDA specifically, but have you seen it in any of the agencies?
No, but just starting to.
Okay.
And it's not just FDA, it has to do with a lot of things that no one ever thought they would have to deal with. Like some people I know today, I was talking about, it's an FTC problem, Federal Trade Commission problem, where they need clarification about whether they could do business under certain conditions with a foreign country. We don't know. So the answer is yes, it's starting to hit. I don't know if FDA is going to be hit as hard as some of the other agencies in the long term, again, because medical devices are a moneymaker for the United States. But again, there's ideology mixed in here too, so I don't know what will happen.
Yeah, I think it's really it remains to be seen. I think because a lot of the agency's budget is driven by user fees, they
Mhm.
should be able to retain more of their staff, but there's so much in flux.
And again,
Uh,
there's the whole ideological issue, which none of us can answer.
yeah, yeah. And one last question as we seem to be coming up on time. What are your thoughts on the device industry's appetite for AI?
Very, very high. But let me be blunt. There's some places where it's sort of like a log going into a sawmill, and so the buzz saw sort of hit one end of the log is cutting through, and the other end is completely undisturbed. It's 30 feet away or whatever. Nothing's happening. Where we're seeing AI right now is primarily in two areas: imaging and diagnostics. And there's been imaging AI for some time now, and it is just getting better in leaps and bounds. So, of course, when I say imaging, I'm talking about x rays and MRIs and CT scans and things like that. The ability to use AI to pre screen the images and really get a radiologist focused on an area of import, this is already happening in a big way and is continuing to improve. The other area is diagnostics. Again, something very similar, looking at just a bunch of readings out of a series of diagnostic tests, being able to take a lot of the labor out of having a human do it for letting a machine at least do the first part of it. But trust me, it's going to be everywhere. And again, it goes back to that digitization issue. The thing about digital systems is they don't forget. Everything gets recorded in a database. All 22 million of intuitive surgical procedures are recorded somewhere in a database, move by move by move, and including the results. With AI, we have the ability to sit there and look at this enormous amount of data that's being collected and say what worked and what didn't. So when a physician is facing a complex situation, they can tap into a database like this. We're getting to this point. We have ways and say, I've got this set of symptoms on this patient. What has worked before for others? And bingo, rather than just asking the three guys he works with at the hospital, he has global information at his fingertips about the best approach. So yeah, it's going to be everywhere. Not only primarily, I'm thinking on the therapeutic side. I'm sure it'll be on the workflow side, but definitely on the therapeutic side, it will be everywhere as we build these enormous databases of results.
All right. Well, on that note, Tony, thank you so much for your time today. These market forces, supply chains, this impacts the work of our audience every day, and the landscape seems to be shifting just as frequently. We know your expertise and your perspective will be a valuable resource for our clients.
Thank you very much.